Welcome, everyone. Students, thanks for joining. I see some of you have your cameras on, and as folks are getting settled into the space, I just want to thank everyone for being here, and of course, welcome and thank you to our alumni for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Cassie Petoskey, and I use she or they pronouns. And I'm the director of the Waldron Student Alumni Connections program, where our goal is really to help Weinberg College students explore different career options through connecting with alumni through programs like today's panel. So before getting into the conversation, we're so excited to hear more from our alumni about their language majors and all their different experiences since graduating. I just want to, set the stage with students. And if you can, students who are on the call, please send in a chat and let us know what you're majoring in. Or if you're undeclared, undecided, let us know what you're thinking about. You don't have to have it declared, to send in a chat. I'm just curious if we have some of our language majors, or if there are people considering different things right now and haven't declared that. So as we're getting started, students, feel free to send in what you're majoring in, and our alumni can kind of get a gauge on who all is in the space. And as well, before we get going, students, I would encourage everyone to turn on your cameras as much as possible. We totally understand if you're at Norris and there are people behind you, or you're in transit across campus, that's okay. We just want to see, who's on the call, and it's just helps our alumni know a little bit more about who they're speaking with today. And I would also encourage you to rename yourself with your pronouns in your class year, so that if, when you're asking questions, we know a little bit about you. Awesome. And then we're going to get into some prepared questions, introductions from these great alumni in a few minutes, but we are going to save plenty of time at the end of the conversation for questions from you all. So students, feel free to send in those questions as they come to you. You can send them into the public chat if you want me to call on you for you to ask that question. I'll call on you to turn on your mic and talk with the alumni, or you can send me a private chat if you want me to ask the question for you. Great. Without further ado, I'm excited to welcome our alumni for joining us. And Catherine, I'd love to start with you with some introductions. If you can share a little bit more about what you studied at Northwestern and a little bit about what you're doing today.
Yeah, so I'm Catherine Johnson, class of 1998. And I majored in Spanish language and literature. I actually was pre-med at the time, and complete career left turn. I'm currently director of film marketing and home entertainment at Warner Brothers.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. And Chris.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Schmidt. I'm a Weinberg class of 2010, where I was a German major and a history minor, and have spent most of my post-college years in marketing roles. Started out in marketing research, and have spent the last 5 or 6 years in both business to business and business to consumer marketing roles. And I currently work in sort of upstream marketing or marketing strategy and product strategy for LyondellBasell, which is a petrochemical company. And specifically, I work on the recycled plastics business.
Great. And Julian.
Yes, I'm Julian Boyd, Weinberg graduate 2005, majored in Italian literature and culture and international studies. I had been econ major essentially until I studied abroad my junior year, and then kind of had the epiphany that I did not love economics in and of itself, and kind of had some other interests. But right now I am working as kind of a product lead within Kinetic, which is a market research data company in agriculture industry.
That's great. And Julian, we'll start with you with our first question. And let's go back to when you were a student at Northwestern. And if you can share some of the impactful classes, experiences, things that you did while you were on campus as an undergrad that kind of helped you figure out what you might want to do, that would be great.
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, I knew I had wanted to do something in, general business field coming in. I thought economics was kind of going to be the best route into that. As I kind of took courses, I would take core courses, and then others. And I would say one thing, I knew I also wanted to study abroad. And so anything I was doing, I knew I was going to be taking kind of a year out. And so as I got kind of closer to that point, I really made the realization, I think it was, econometrics, that like econ just wasn't really where my passions were. And I'd always heard, it's important to study something that you enjoy, because as much of kind of what you're learning is kind of almost how to learn and things like that. And so with that and kind of studying abroad, I just kind of gave up the maybe pressure I had on myself in economics, wanted to try something else, kind of dove into Italian and international studies, which really was, interdisciplinary major, and then just started to kind of find a lot of things that were interesting to me, ultimately kind of guiding me to my first role coming out of college, which was in kind of an international kind of hybrid of project management and kind of data design type role with the Nielsen company.
That's great. Thanks, Julian. And we'll dive into some more of these experiences. I see we have some students who are sharing they're also international studies and some other various interests, and maybe they'll tack on a language now that, hearing more about your experiences, which is great. And Chris, if we can go to you about your impactful experiences as an undergrad.
Yeah, so I had the same epiphany as Julian, where I dropped my econ major sophomore year. I think it was actually after taking econometrics as well. But I to the similar point, my heart wasn't really in it. And I was a econ and German double major, so I kept my German and tacked on a history focus as well. And I think one of the when I think back about that and the impact that it had, to Julian's point, studying something that you're interested in and that really speaks to you and motivates you sort of internally is incredibly valuable, because Northwestern isn't a trade school. You're not necessarily going to learn how to do XYZ tasks in your course. The real value that you get from a university education in general, and specifically a liberal arts college, is learning how to learn and learning how to take in a lot of information, synthesize it into what matters, and then communicate that effectively. And I think that that's something that, as I think back on my classes in German in particular, that's a lot of what we did in terms of like text analysis and things like that. And history was sort of the same way. And as I think about the roles that I've had throughout my career, that's been a real distinguishing, unique selling point for me and my skill set, is being able to sort of deal with ambiguity. So being able to look at different data points and sort of understand what are they saying, what do they mean within the context of if they're working together, or if they're sort of contradictory, and then being able to create an argument out of that. And I think that that's something that I certainly got a lot of experience in my humanities classes and my language class in particular. And it's been something that served me very well in my career.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Chris. And Catherine, same question to you.
So I went in to school thinking I was going to practice medicine and I would major in a science, and I was thinking biology, and I soon learned that you didn't have to major in a science, to get into a med school program. And so I decided that I wanted to major in something that I enjoyed learning. And in high school, I had loved Spanish class that I was taking. And then I knew that I could study abroad with that major, or it was a requirement at the time. And so I decided to declare Spanish language and literature as my major while still pursuing the pre-med courses. So I really loved my study abroad experience, and just having that kind of global perspective. And it was actually, I actually ended my pre-med courses probably around junior year, and then decided to actually I kind of picked back up and did a post-baccalaureate program, pre-med program after I graduated actually. But shortly after that realized like it just wasn't where my passions lied. And I ended up pursuing a more business course, and I ended up going back to school years later and got an MBA from UCLA Anderson. And it was a joint program between them and the National University of Singapore's business school. So I got an MBA from both schools while attending, like we had to, in order to get your MBA from both, you had to attend courses on both campuses with a ton of other courses and locations in between. So like Shanghai and Bangalore, India. And so there were several, so over that 2-year period, there was a lot of international travel, and I did all while I was working at Mattel at the time. So it was a busy couple of years, but I think that that travel bug was sparked back then and when I was doing my study abroad, and the fact that I could do something like that in my business school as well was really exciting to me. So yeah, I've pursued this marketing life, and it's a complete departure obviously from my pre-med world, but I'm just really happy. I was in a place where, all my friends had graduated after Northwestern and they were off, working, and I was still in a lab, and it just wasn't as exciting as I thought it was going to be. So I switched courses, and, you don't know early on, where life is going to take you, but I just suggest like being open, and, you have an idea of what you want to do going in, and there's so many just career opportunities that that's just my suggestion, is just being open.
Yeah, that's great, Catherine. And I love hearing a little bit more about the study abroad experience. I want to dive into that. And I don't know if you saw some of our science folks. We have a handful I've seen, bio, neuroscience in the chat. I'm curious if some of those might be some pre-med pivot folks as well. But anyways, Catherine, I want to dive into the study abroad and the language courses specifically, because I'm curious if you can speak to how you feel like that study abroad and your Spanish courses on campus impact and influence your career today, like the work you're doing.
Yeah, so I think, so I manage a domestic team, but we have a global outlook on the business. So I'm currently at Warner Brothers, like I said, doing home entertainment. So that's everything outside the theaters when you're able to view films and TV after the theatrical period. So it's kind of a transactional business where you can buy it on iTunes, you can rent it on a DirecTV or things like that. So I do the marketing for all of the films in our catalog. So over 4,000, anything from Crazy Rich Asians to Shawshank Redemption. So I manage that piece of the business, and we work really closely with our international counterparts around the world. I mean, we're constantly in contact with our UK team in France and Italy and our Asian markets, and just having a perspective on the world, and just being able to manage back to the territories is always really important. And I think just being open to their needs is really important. And I think having that study abroad experience and just traveling, kind of opens you up to that. So I think that's one way that was really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great, Catherine. And Chris, same question to you about study abroad. If you could share a little bit about your experience and how that's influencing your work.
Sure. So I was actually fortunate enough to study abroad twice. I did my senior year of high school in Berlin on a congressional scholarship, and then I went back to Germany. And my junior year, I spent in Munich on a German sort of study abroad scholarship. So I was very fortunate to be able to go abroad twice for 2 years, and it's something that I would recommend to everyone without reservation. I think it's an incredible personal experience, just from the growing and the maturing that you do when you put yourself in a new circumstance, and it's particularly something that's a new cultural context. It's just it can be challenging, but it's challenging in a good way. And I think it creates a lot of good excuse me. It promotes a lot of good learning You learn a lot about yourself and sort of your cultural or your cultural touchstones, why you think about things the way that you do, and it challenges you to really sort of justify some of the the opinions or like the thought process that you have, and challenges you to maybe think about things in a new context. So I would recommend it wholeheartedly, even if it's a shorter program. I know Northwestern has a lot of like 6-week things over the summer that are easier to fit in than a whole year maybe. But as I think about how it's impacted me, like after college and in my career, there's a lot of really strong benefits. So one is if you are studying a language, you'll never find any course or anything that is as good as getting plopped down in a country where the people speak the language. So there's that very practical benefit. And there's a lot of evidence too that like learning 2 different languages actually helps with like creative thinking, and it sort of makes your brain fire a little bit differently than people who are monolingual. But as I think about some of the other contexts, there's a lot of sort of interpersonal skills that you develop when you're living in a different cultural context, and it, like I said earlier, it sort of helps you understand better like why you're thinking in certain ways. And that's really important as you get into particularly business, but anything that you do after you graduate. You're going to have to be a critical thinker to advance. Like that's probably the biggest differentiator in terms of skill sets. You can learn how to do this task or that task, but knowing how to look at something and really like be critical about like what are the components that make this up, and what is the sort of impact of like this decision or something like that is incredibly meaningful, incredibly important. And it's something that I feel like I sort of got a little turbocharged training course in by being abroad and having to navigate these situations where I didn't have all of the context that I had living in my home culture. It just challenges you to be a little bit more intellectually curious and intellectually nimble too when you're thinking about like how to respond to things.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. That's great. Lots of great examples about the study abroad impacting you and the way you think. And Julian, how has your study abroad and language major impacted you?
Yeah, similar to both Catherine and Chris. I mean, study abroad really reoriented, not just, what I was going to choose to study, but kind of my perspective overall, personally. As I've gone into a career, it helped me to just kind of like Chris had said, and Catherine, look at, be able to kind of critically look at, maybe how something works in one place. Does that apply in another place? How things are different from, country to country, region to region. I know as I started studying a language, you really think of it transactionally, just in terms of being able to understand and speak. But really, when you get into it, and like Chris had mentioned, being in the place, just being immersed in the language, you realize you're thinking in a different way, fundamentally based off of language, like how you're actually constructing sentences is different. It just makes you think about things in different ways at a technical level. And so that kind of carries throughout, culturally understanding how things are different, how different ways of doing things. These are all kind of core components that, I take in work as you are doing product discovery, trying to understand kind of what's the core need that someone has, going through kind of being more open, not taking as many of your preconceived notions in, letting yourself be a little more open to kind of hear what they're telling you, get to underlying kind of like the root of what they're telling you, to be able to kind of synthesize that and draw conclusions. All things that, not just in work, I think in personal life, the ability to kind of really listen, synthesize, not just kind of waiting for your turn to give your opinion, but really synthesize what's being said and then responding to it is, I mean, that's like 100%, language study abroad. That's what you're doing. So really kind of emphasizes those kind of critical pieces that I think are really the strengths I've taken into any role, has been that ability. And then learning, on top of that as I've gone through my career.
Yeah, that's great, Julian. And it's been really interesting hearing how the study abroad experiences, were similar and different in some ways. And I know all of you have mentioned in one way or another, like being, submerged into a different culture, a different language, learned so much, challenged you. I'm curious how, just broadly, both in, your undergraduate experience, but also beyond in your career, how have your identity impacted your career? And Julian, let's start with you.
Yeah. So again, it's had a huge impact. I think that's where, again, through study abroad, it kind of helped me to kind of find the identity that I thought really would resonate in terms of the skill that I can bring to any job. Again, that's, has always been for me, trying to be thoughtful about understanding kind of what someone else is saying, what their needs are, and or not just needs, kind of the information they're passing along, and being able to work through that. My identity, that's exactly kind of, through each, stage of personal life, or even kind of schooling. I've been very, I would say, driven, as I think probably most students at Northwestern would have to be to kind of get into school, but kind of taking myself out of it and seeing, like, what do I really enjoy doing? What do I think I'm strong at? What do I want to lean into? And that's where I think, language and that that part of the liberal arts education really, paid off, where you certainly have doubts, going through and thinking, should I be learning how to do something specific? And then I think, especially as you go further and further in your career, I couldn't be more thankful for, like, the ability to critical think, where sometimes, and maybe this will sound kind of, self, we maybe pat ourselves on the back too much, Northwestern, but you're surrounded by, really intelligent, smart kids, right? When you get out into the world, you're going to be meeting all kinds of people, right? And so you really value kind of that base that you've been able to develop, through your career, knowing that it's not as common as maybe you would hope otherwise.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Julian. And Chris, how has your identity impacted your career?
Yeah, I would say that one of the takeaways that I had from studying a different language, and I think you get this a lot in sort of the language and literature, especially when you get into the literature and the sort of cultural aspects of the language study, and certainly studying abroad as well, is that there's a little bit of like forced introspection that happens there when you're confronted with this context of a different cultural context. It sort of makes you think a little bit more about yourself, of like, why do I think the things that I think? How am I, like, what is the sort of thought process for arriving at this conclusion or this opinion that I have? And that is incredibly valuable. It's an incredibly valuable skill to have as you progress through your career, because it will help you understand what your motivators are, which can then be an incredible guider, a guiding factor when you're thinking about, do I want to do like postgraduate study, or do I want to go into this career path versus that career path? Understanding, being able to sort of have a honest conversation with yourself around what motivates you, what doesn't motivate you, how you learn, that can have an incredible impact on your career. And it's the better you are at doing that, the better decisions, or the more good, well-informed decisions you'll be able to make as you start to navigate your career. And so as I think specifically about that, it's had a really big impact on my career choices. So I started out in market research, which was a career that I didn't even really realize existed until I was starting to apply for jobs. And when I started to think about, what is it that I'm interested in? What is it that motivates me? And I thought about, answering sort of big questions and looking at trends and understanding what they were going to do and how they impact people's behavior. It was a career field that sort of lended itself well to that motivation or that curiosity. And then as I started to evolve my career and thinking about what I wanted to do for my next steps, again, that sort of introspection was really helpful. And I think that the base sort of fact is that the more experiences that you gather and the broader experiences that you have in learning a second language, especially living somewhere else abroad, it's a differentiator when you're talking about whether it's a law school or a business school or a med school, and they're looking at candidates. People who have a greater breadth of experience can bring more. They can bring more sort of intellectual curiosity, and they bring a little bit more to like the group experience that all of these sort of professional schools require, that you don't necessarily have if you're a more monopath person. So to me, that's been one of my sort of key takeaways. I think it's probably the biggest benefit that I've gotten from studying a different language and from living abroad, because I don't necessarily use my German every day in my work, but I use the skills and I use the introspective capabilities that I developed from it.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think that's great for students to hear that you don't have to use it every day for it to be valuable, to have in your skill set. That's great. And Catherine, how has your identity impacted your career?
So I was born in Chicago, and my parents and I moved to Los Angeles when I was 4, and I'm only child and very close to my parents. And so as I was choosing a school, I realized that I needed to kind of spread my wings. And so I went off to, Evanston on my own, and did have a little bit of family there, so I had some support. But, just being on campus on your own, and for the first time, I was kind of gaining more confidence of being independent. And that really led me to doing this study abroad program. And going across the world as on your own, it really does help with that kind of independence, that kind of independent free thinking. And that's really become my identity. And I feel like that really helps me in my just day-to-day life and decisions that I make. And but really my decisions that I make at work. And that's something that's really helped me push through my career, and it just kind of catapulted my career trajectory in terms of being looked at as someone that can work independently, that can think about projects on their own and be self-motivated and things like that. So I think that really was a big kind of turning point in kind of who I am now and today. So yeah.
That's great. Absolutely. A lot of great skills that we're building and, aspects of your identities, gathered through these experiences, which is great. And a big stress point, I'm sure you all remember, for our students who are on the call, is really that first job out of school. It feels like everyone is landing these perfect jobs. It feels like there's pressure for you to land a perfect job that's going to put you on the path to success, right? And you all are successful alumni who are not doing the thing you started out doing. So I would love to hear a little bit more about that first job and how that influenced your path. And Catherine, we'll start with you.
Sure. First job was as a merchandiser and marketing role. And it was at a men's necktie manufacturer, and it was privately owned. And, I was starting to think about my next steps outside of this pre-med thinking and, getting into marketing as kind of entry level. And, it was a great opportunity to kind of learn. And that was my first exposure, like I said, outside of a a lab, and outside of thinking about anatomy and things like that. So it was really interesting. And it was my first kind of taste of it. And I probably was there for about I would say probably about a year and a half before I had an opportunity to move into. That was where I kind of realized, okay, I wanted to do more traditional marketing in consumer products goods company, and I had an opportunity to join Mattel in a consumer products role. So I took that opportunity, and again, that's not the first job, but moving into Mattel, that's where I was able to really see what true marketing was, and all the different aspects of it, and be able to, take in this different information from cross-functional teams to kind of synthesize down that information. And I quickly learned that I wanted to do even more, because the consumer products role is kind of a licensing role where we license out our different intellectual property to manufacturers. And on the other side of the aisle, the toy team was doing kind of global brand marketing. And I started doing a little bit of networking, and that's when I ended up going back to business school. And that gave me an opportunity to say, let these executives know, like, hey, this is what I'm working on in school. I'd love to join this team once I graduate. And so I started setting those kind of markers up for myself. And can I check back in with you in 6 months once I'm graduated, and things like that. So that's kind of my path and how I landed here, I guess. So
Yeah, that's great, Catherine. And it's fun to hear, just how each step kind of impacted the next one. I think it's really helpful for students to hear that, kind of comes together as you're in these roles.
Yeah, I think it's just kind of building those building blocks and that foundation. And again, like, you're not going to know always exactly where your path is going to end, but as long as you are open to looking around and seeing what other cross-functional teams are doing at this job. This might not be your dream job when you first get out of school, but it's going to be a huge learning ground for you. And it's going to be an opportunity to, start networking around the company, making connections outside of the company. And, you're always going to be working with external partners. And, if that's something that you're interested in, keeping those connections going and moving on to the next thing. But again, it's just being open to what's out there and not having tunnel vision, I think. And of course, you can have an exact idea of what you want to do and want to go down that path, and that's great too. But I think always being open to different opportunities is really important.
Absolutely. That's great. Thanks, Catherine. And Chris, how did your first job play out and impact your path?
Yeah. So I guess I would start by saying there does oftentimes, like, it seems like a big choice, and it seems like a choice when if you're choosing between different jobs or even different fields. It feels like a lot of pressure when you're in school, and it feels like it can be very much a defining choice for where you're going to end up in your career. But the reality is, unless you're better at picking Powerball numbers than I am, you're going to be working for 40 or 50 years. And you're going to have a lot of chances to jump different industries, jump different roles within the industry. So I would caution everybody against putting too much concern around, like, where you start your career, because there are a lot of routes to get wherever you're trying to go. And it's good to be thoughtful about what you're trying to do, but I wouldn't say that, if you don't end up in the role that you've been dreaming of right out of college, that doesn't mean you won't get there. And as I think about this myself, I joined a market research company in downtown Chicago after graduating, and I really didn't even know what market research was or that it existed beforehand. But I came across it, and as I read the job description, it was really much about going out and finding information and then building an argument based on that that is convincing to the most amount of people. And so that was very much what I did in my coursework. And it was a big part of actually what I enjoyed about my coursework was sort of building arguments out of disparate data points. And as I think back about, how I was there for probably about 6 years out of school. I was able to sort of evolve in different roles and different levels of responsibility at the company. And I think a big part of that, of why I had success there, was that I was intellectually curious. So I was willing to learn either new skills or even just sort of explore different ways of doing like work that we had in place. And a big part of it, to Catherine's point, is like the internal networking. That's an incredibly important part of whatever you're doing, whether you're in a very technical field or a more sort of free-form field. Like a lot of the benefit and a lot of what sort of boosts your career, or what will serve as like an elevator in your career, is your ability to network. And it's not just schmoozing with people, it's like understanding what are the pathways within the organization that you're in, and who do you need to talk to get not just your name in front of somebody, but to actually get like beneficial information that will help you make better decisions, or help you position yourself for your next role. I also went to business school, as Catherine mentioned, and when I think back of like a big part of the application process is sort of explaining why you want to go to business school and why you want to go to this business school specifically. And that's, I think, where a big part of the benefit that I got from studying languages and living abroad and being that sort of ability to be introspective really helped my argument there, because I was able to paint a much more compelling story of what it was about my internal motivators that were pushing me to make this decision, and why it made sense for me, and why the school that I applied to made sense. And then it was the same once I got there. I originally thought I was going to go into consumer marketing, but I was open, and I was networking with a lot of people, and I actually ended up going into more of a business to business marketing role, because I met people that I was interested in, and that I had sort of genuine conversations with about what is the work that you're doing, what do you get out of it in terms of like the motivating factors and what you're learning. And so I ended up sort of pivoting from what I thought was my target outcome. And after a couple of years, I realized, no, I think I do want to get back into that. And so I put in the work to start networking again, and made the transition back to where I was going. So that's, I guess, my sort of key takeaway here is like, it's important to have a job, but I wouldn't be so concerned about having the exact perfect job, or the job that you've been that you think that you've wanted for years and years right out of the bat.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris. I think it's so important to hear that too. Catherine mentioned the pre-med path. We have so many students who are on that path and are likely going to pivot. Students who think they have the idea of the perfect job in their head before, they come into school, and then it evolves. Absolutely. And it's a starting point. So that's great. And Julian,
so many of the jobs that you're going to get, all the skills are transferable, like the things that you're learning, the things that the organizational skills, the being able to set a strategy and, be able to take information in and synthesize it down. All of those skills are going to be transferable to the next job, whether it's a pivot in career or not. So keep that in mind. To Chris's point, it might not be your exact dream job, but you can use those relevant skills in the next, in your next opportunity. And that's how you can kind of position yourself when you're in those interviews too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Catherine. And Julian, let's hear about your first job and how that impacted your path.
Yeah. Similarly, I think coming out of college, I was very keen on getting what a dream job would be. And I think it's also important just to like let ourselves know what you think of a dream job coming out of college is not going to be your dream job, because it's, it's an entry level job, really, right? So what I found is you want to find a job that's going to be building skills that can be transferable, like Catherine and Chris had mentioned. So like I said, I was coming out of college, I was just very set on, I wanted to find a job in Italy to use my Italian. Really, as I kind of, very specifically went out, I was kind of looking at a lot of consulting companies that had offices in Italy, kind of come to the realization like that's a pretty specific cross section of jobs that I'm looking at. So, okay, maybe what do I actually want to do like in one of these jobs? And so I kind of, had gone through recruiting cycles, interview cycles, and through that actually came to find out about the Nielsen company, which they do both media, kind of monitoring the media industry in terms of, what is the high performing, low performing in television, and then also their consumer goods side, which kind of similarly around the world is kind of monitoring what's kind of bought and sold around the world. And so through that, I kind of it was, I think, interviewing at some consulting firm, they kind of connected me with Nielsen, and they kind of had like a smaller startup group that was doing this global consumer goods work with kind of headquarters at companies like Coca-Cola, Kraft, which is in the Chicagoland area, and working with them to understand essentially how their business is doing globally, being able to compare regionally, compare globally, where every market is kind of built in a silo, and so they were looking at how can they report apples to apples, so to speak, around the globe. And so my first job was, Nielsen has offices or had offices in all of the world, but it's kind of working with all of those different teams to kind of build the underlying data in a way that can be leveraged. And then what we eventually, as I kind of progressed through my time there, had been at that company like over 10 years in kind of varying roles, kind of going through more of a matrix of, figuring out, I like this part of this job, but then I kind of got this skill over in like the analytics team, and eventually kind of came over to product, kind of building these products that serve these global needs. So my first role was really in kind of general, before we had kind of built so many robust kind of product offerings. It's kind of building these smaller scale deliverables to these, regional or global headquarters. And then, just kind of built my skills, working with different teams. And as the organization grew, kind of finding opportunities to eventually, get to a point where I felt like I'd gained and kind of gotten into more of what, the dream job I was looking for, where I could travel internationally for work and get to use Italian with colleagues, even if it's just at the beginning or ends of calls, to connect a little more.
Yeah, that's great, Julian. Thank you. And I'm going to ask one more question before we dive into student questions. So students on the call, feel free to keep sending in your questions to me in a private chat if you want me to ask it, or please feel free to send in a chat to the public chat if you would like to be called on to ask your question. But I want to hear just from our alumni speakers today. We've been talking with students a little bit about industry and job function and how they're different. And I kind of want to dive into the industry piece with you all. If you can give just like a very brief synopsis of your industry, and then share a little bit about how it's been impacted through the pandemic and now, ChatGPT, AI, generative AI. There's just been a lot of changes over the last couple of years. Curious how that's impacted your industry. So Julian, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, I'll say kind of the core industry I'm in, agriculture, is new to me in the last 6 months. I kind of took a new role here. Kind of the surface industry being tech, building, software as a solution products. That's kind of been my more professional history across other industries, and so. I think your first question was related to pandemic. Is that right? Yeah. So pandemic wise, I mean, tech, I was remote for much of my job prior to pandemic. And so really that didn't have much impact on me. I'd been working across kind of time zones. And so you're kind of used to not working with a lot of your team face to face anyway. And so that in some ways was kind of a seamless transition. I know a lot of friends for like, 10 plus years were joking how I would never go to the office and how I had life so easy. And then they, everyone kind of brought their work home through that period. And where that was kind of a bigger transition for others, that was really, I think, easier for tech in the sense of you're built to be remote in some capacity, especially in kind of global. However, more product specific, certainly it's hard not to be able to collaborate. I think doing a lot of product discovery, remote makes it easy, as everyone has kind of gotten used to being remote, to kind of get make lots of connections with lots of stakeholders, get their feedback. But what I've found is it is a little bit more challenging to get a little deeper in some of those conversations when they are remote. Thankfully now we are able to kind of set more, milestone check-ins with different stakeholders that can be in person, where you can do a little more deep dive, whiteboarding type sessions to really get to some underlying issues they're maybe facing, and how maybe what you're working on may be able to help them solve their kind of underlying needs. But yeah, and then I will say also just kind of to the agriculture or really data collection. I know the pandemic had a big impact in kind of shifting how these industries look at collecting data, where a lot of it had been very operationally intensive with, Nielsen is, people on the ground, doing surveys and whatnot. Agriculture, similarly, anytime there's kind of panels that have to be run and projected off of, that's, had been very in-person focused. So I think overall a lot has developed and kind of been forced to develop, like how maybe data collection is handled. And so it's kind of forced a lot of things to be modernized pretty rapidly. So yeah, that's kind of been my experience.
Yeah, that's great, Julian. Thank you. That's really helpful. And Chris, can you give the students a little bit of an idea about your industry and the shifts?
Sure. So similar to Julian, I actually changed industries pretty recently. During the pandemic, I was working in packaged food, so I worked for Kraft Heinz, specifically for their food service business, which is everywhere that you eat outside of the house. So you can imagine we were impacted pretty heavily because our customer base was restaurants and stadiums and all the places that got closed during the pandemic. And so we went from being sort of the darling of the company that was growing faster than the grocery store side to being down 70-80% year over year in April of 2020. So it did cause a pretty substantial shift in terms of how the food industry worked. There was a lot of trends that were sort of had been percolating and building up that didn't necessarily stop, but they paused. So there was a big movement from consumers back to like nostalgic brands. So things like Kraft mac and cheese and these like the not better for you versions of foods that had been sort of steadily going down year over year. They actually sort of boomed during the pandemic as people looked for everyday indulgence and ways to sort of provide a little like cheer and comfort in their lives. That sort of washed out now. I think we're back towards that. People are generally a little bit more, they're getting more conscious again about sort of what they eat. But I think the biggest change was like how the company actually worked. And there was a lot of focus on how do we change processes to make sure that if we can't get 5 or 6 people into a room to bang something out really quickly, how do we have like efficient processes to make sure that these are going on? Because one of the biggest issues, certainly at the companies that I worked at during the pandemic, I think in general, was there's a massive proliferation of meetings, whereas before the pandemic, you would maybe have 2 or 3, 4 meetings a week. All of a sudden, you were having 3 or 4 a day, and it led to a lot of brain drain in that you essentially didn't have time to do work during the day because you were sitting in all of these meetings. And so there's a little bit of an overreaction early on in that people wanted to drive, or companies are trying to drive sort of hyper connectivity by getting everybody onto these calls. And I think that's something that we've seen as the pandemic has shifted and remote work has become more common, is companies are being a lot more deliberate about how they schedule time in order to free up people's schedules to have time to actually like sit down and work on something. So that's been, I would say, one of the biggest changes, and that's been facilitated too by a lot of like the tech development. So like we're all on Zoom right now. In my experience, it was very uncommon to be on any sort of like teleconference, video conferencing thing before the pandemic. And we have a lot of productivity tools, I think, that have been developed during the pandemic that will help remote teams or decentralized teams, whatever you want to call them, collaborate either in real time, or my sort of hope is that we'll be pushing towards more like decentralized schedules where everybody just sort of works during the time of day that they work the best. And then we use these tech solutions to make sure that if I'm a night owl and I work better from 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. And Julian or Catherine or early risers, that we can do our work sort of separately, and then we can use these tech tools to sort of coalesce everything into the equivalent of what you would get if we were all sitting in a room together. So that's, I think, the biggest change that I've seen in terms of like the way that people work. It's hard for me to say like industry wise how it's really impacted. I'm relatively new to like the packaging industry that I'm in now. There was definitely a huge boom during COVID because everybody was ordering stuff online. That's petered out a little bit. And I think the concern about sustainability has definitely been driven up as people started to see how much they were consuming and how much like waste there is in packaging. So that's definitely been an impact. To the point about AI, I think it's really early to tell, frankly, for at any company of like a large size. Very few of them have had really meaningful implementations of like true AI solutions. And so I think companies are still trying to figure out where does it fit within our work streams. Are there work streams that we can completely replace with this, or is it really only going to be sort of an augmentation tool? I don't think that's shaken out yet, and I don't really realistically think that it's going to happen in the next couple of years. I think people are there's a lot of inertia, especially at big companies, around adopting new technology.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chris. And Catherine, curious if you could share just a little bit about your industry and shifts over the last few years.
Sure. So I'm in entertainment news industry. So Warner Brothers Discovery Plus, CNN, HBO, Max, and we have a gaming component, Warner Brothers Games as well. So I've been here for about 7.5 years now. And you hear about windows a lot in the entertainment industry. So there's obviously the theatrical window, then it comes to the home, which is the group that I'm in. So, and then our group is broken into 2 groups, which is the theatrical new release. So right when it's been released, and then in the film catalog business, and that's the part that I manage. And so speaking to Chris's point of being like kind of the darling of your company, so obviously theatrical is the big sexy news during the pandemic. Obviously theaters were closed and everyone's watching and streaming and, you know, buying movies and TV shows online. And so home entertainment, the group that I'm in, you know, kind of became the main revenue driver during the time. And we had to get really creative about the different type of programs that we provided to retailers. Our main retailers are like an iTunes, Vudu, Amazon, and Prime Video, things like that. So that was a huge shift. We were, you know, that we weren't getting this kind of funnel of theatrical releases. So we really dived into the library of the films and created different programs where there was, you know, movies from this decade or music driven things. So it was a lot of really getting, like I said, creative during that time. And I think the last point is AI. That is a huge kind of issue over entertainment business right now, because obviously we are in the midst, we just finalized an agreement with the Writers Guild, which we're very happy about. And next we have SAG strikes that are still going on. But one of the key points in both of the kind of tensions has been AI. And so I haven't seen the final points that were in the deal memos from the writers agreement, but just making sure that humans have opportunities was a big piece of the conversation. And just having, you know, clearance rights to background actors and things like that. So it's been a huge conversation. And I think that conversation is going to keep going. I mean, obviously technology is evolving, but we you know, have to obviously be sensitive to the creators and artists that are involved. So yeah, I think that this is going to be an interesting cultural conversation that's mixed with technology that is going to be it's going to be a point for quite a while. And I think that AI and this whole ChatGPT, I think it's something that, like I said, it is going to be a continued topic. So I think getting a really good understanding of it now is really going to help all of us, no matter what industry you're in. I think it's going to be a topic again for quite a while.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Catherine and Chris and Julian. I know we only have a minute left, but this has been really great hearing from you all about your language majors, experiences, industries, all the different, you know, twists and turns on your career journeys. One other question I just wanted to quickly ask was about working and landing a job working abroad. Do you know, and I know we mentioned some different experiences working at global companies. Are there any specific industries or specific advice you may have for this student who is looking to land a job working in the EU specifically?
Yeah, I would say that, I mean, obviously making sure that when you're looking for your next company, it's really looking at where their interests lie from a business perspective, and really understanding what offices they have in other countries. There are a few countries where you can't work unless the company sponsors you and moves there. So for an example, Singapore, they really take seriously the fact that they're the small little nation, and their residents are their you know, are their main concern and their main resource. And so they don't want to be taking jobs away from the folks there. So if you work for a Boston consulting group and they move you to Singapore, that's one thing, but you can't just move there and start working for a Boston consulting group. So I think understanding those type of nuances with whatever company you're going to start with, I think is important. And you know, for example, Mattel, I traveled a lot internationally because we had offices all over the world. So just understanding what that company's offices are and any type of opportunities that you have. Just at Warner Brothers a couple of years ago, I did a job rotation to the theatrical team because someone on the theatrical team was doing a job rotation to our Paris offices. So just understanding the types of opportunities and asking those questions during interviews I think is fair, or talking to people that are in the companies that will know about the different opportunities is really important.
Yeah, that's great, Catherine and Chris.
Yeah, that was what I would bring up is rely on your network. Like the Northwestern network is very large. Go on LinkedIn, find people at the companies that you think you might be interested in, and just reach out to them and ask if it's a specific question like this. You can ask even if it's just, hey, I think I might be interested in working at your company or in your industry or in your function, if it's marketing or supply chain or whatever. Lean on the network that you have. It's easier to find information from people who are already on the inside. And in my experience, the Northwestern network is very open and helpful.
Absolutely. That's great. And Julian, did you have anything to add as well?
I was just going to kind of reiterate what Catherine was saying, because that's specifically, I was really trying to find a job in Italy as coming immediately out of college, and it was very hard. And that's where I found opportunities to start within the US for a company that has offices in any place that you're interested in, and understand, do your research, certainly reach out to your network if you have people at these companies that you can reach out to understand what that transition might look like. But that has been, I think, the kind of tried and true formula that I've seen.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really helpful hearing, personal experiences and advice and insights. This is really great. Thank you all so much for being here. Alumni, thank you for sharing your great insights. And students, of course, thank you for logging in. Definitely keep an eye out for an email from us, from Joseph, with information about Grubhub credits in lieu of, having food at our events. We'll send you Grubhub credits. And also we'll be sharing out our alumni's LinkedIn information so you can connect further, ask other follow-up questions there. So thank you all so much again, and go Cats.